So Unity's new input system has been around for a while now, a couple years, but it's not immediately obvious how you access it. I mean, I have the 2020.3 version of Unity installed, and it's still not included in the default settings. So whether you're starting from scratch or you have a project already using the old input system, I'm going to show you how you can go ahead and convert to the new one. So let's take a look at this project here. So right now in this project, I just have a player you can move in the X and Y axis. And here's the simple script for it. We're just getting the X and Y inputs, and then we're basically just moving our rigid body in those directions. But I want to focus on these two lines here, where we say input.getAxis, horizontal and vertical. This is the old input system. And we're passing in this string of horizontal and vertical. And if we go to our project settings in the editor and go to Input Manager, we can expand this axis caret and you'll see horizontal and vertical inputs here. And if we expand horizontal, you'll see it has A, D, left and right, and vertical is WS and up and down arrow keys. So this is how it was done before. You would configure these axes, you would give it a name, and in script you'd have to use these strings verbatim. If you spelt it wrong or used the capital wrong, well, you were screwed. And if you're new, this could be an annoying reason why something is breaking. So, as they say, out with the old, in with the new. The first thing we want to do to move over to the new input system is to get the package for it. Because like I said before, it still doesn't come with Unity. So what we can do is on the top, we can go to Window, Package Manager. So depending on what version of Unity you're on, it might default your packages to in project if you expand this dropdown in the top left. But the input system is found under Unity Registry. So we can go to Unity Registry and we can type in input, and you'll see the input system comes up. We just want to click this and hit install. And when it finishes installing, you'll probably get this warning telling you more or less that it's going to disable the old Unity input system, and it will set it up in the back end so you can use the new one, because you can only use one at a time. So here I'll say yes, and it'll restart quick, and when it launches back up, you'll see that it is now installed. This might vary from person to person, but this is an important check. If you go into a script, and at the top you write using unityengine.input, and nothing comes up with input system or anything like that, then you need to regenerate your CS projects in Visual Studio. So in Unity, if you go up to Edit, Preferences, and then External Tools, you'll see this section Generate CS Proj Files for, and in my case you notice Registry Packages is unchecked, which is where we downloaded the input system from. So I need to make sure that it's checked, and I need to regenerate project files. Then I should be able to go back in my script and type using unityengine.inputSystem, and that should come up. So back in our editor, let's take a look at a few ways we can go about implementing the new input system. We could actually click on our player, and if we go to add component, we could type in player input, and here you'll see there's a bunch of options. Most importantly, it says that the actions field is empty. And so we could go ahead and hit create actions and just save it as something like player controls. And you'll notice this asset, it's now in our folder. And if we double click this and open it up, it actually pre-populates us with a bunch of different things. So we have action maps for a player and a UI, which could be like enemies or something like that. And if we click on player, we can expand, let's say, the move. And there's a bunch of different types of things here. There's, the left stick if you're using a gamepad. You can expand WASD, and you have your up key, your W key, like your standard keyboard movements here. You can expand fire, and you see right trigger, left button, primary touch, tap, etc. So you get a whole bunch of baked-in common controls inputs for free, more or less, when you build this out. And I encourage you to take your time to look through this. But if you think that might be overkill for you, or it's a little overwhelming at first, you don't need to start with that. There's actually much simpler ways of doing this. So I'll go ahead and delete those. Let's focus on just converting this simple movement script into using the new input system. So with our using statement at the top of the script, we can go down here and say public input action, and call it whatever you want, maybe player controls. And back in the editor, if we go to our player controller script, you now see player controls as a variable. And so if we hit this plus sign, there's a bunch of different things you can make. But in terms of capturing a horizontal or vertical movement, what we want to do is add a 2D vector composite, because this translates to a vector 2D. And similar to the example, I can call this WASD for keyboard controls, and we can now go ahead and configure these different commands. So for up, we can double click this, and in the path I can press W, and you'll see W keyboard. Or you could also make this whatever you want, like the up arrow key. I'll go ahead and just use WASD for now. I'll set these up really quick. And there we go. We now have our WASD controls set up. So back in our script here, the first thing we want to do is initialize this input action. So to do that, what we can do is void on enable, which is a built-in Unity event. And in here, what we want to say is player controls.enable. And then conversely, what we want to do is void on disable and say player controls.disable. This is a requirement of the new input system. If you don't put these two, you'll get a lot of issues. So now let's talk about how we actually read the inputs. We can go ahead and I'll just comment this out for comparison's sake, but we don't need that anymore. And this move direction here is just a vector2. So what we can say is player controls .read value of type vector2. And the input system should be smart enough to understand we're trying to pull that WASD value. In fixed update, I'm just saying the velocity to the x and y of move direction times the move speed, which in this case is 5. But without making any other changes, just this one line, when we play the game, I'm now able to move my character again, using WASD. So with this approach, it is much simpler. All you need is an input action. But an action is really like movement, or interact, or fire. These are very specific actions. So this would more accurately be called player movement. And then you would have another input action for, say, player attack, or player interact, and you would make separate input actions for each of these, which is a totally fine way of doing it, and you'll have more control, but it is a limited way of using the input system. This will get more complicated, but they do have an entire event system built in with the new input system. So let's just cover that pretty quickly. So let's go back in the editor, and you could right-click on your assets folder and go to Create, Input Actions, and double-click it, and you'll see this familiar setup from before. But I'm going to go ahead and leverage the one that Unity already populates for you. And so to do that, I'll go to my player, I'll add a component, I'll do player input, and I'll select Create Actions. I'll call this player input actions, and then I'm just going to remove this player input component for now. Okay, so if I open up this player input actions, this is where you have the player in the UI from earlier, and it has everything pretty much set up for you. I'm just going to use this for the example. You'll notice if we click this, on the top right, there's a Generate C# class option. We want to select this and hit Apply, and it will create a C# class wherever your input actions were located. So now in our player controller, what we could say is instead of input action, we could say player input actions, which is the name of that script that was just generated. And in here, what we want to do is add a void awake method, which is another Unity event. So in this awake method, awake gets called as the game is loading. And in here, what we want to do for now is say player controls equals new player input actions, which will just initialize the script. So if you actually open up this player input actions and scroll through, it's pretty scary if you don't know what you're looking at here. But the good news is you don't really have to mess with it. So if we open up this input map, you'll notice we have a few actions. We have move, look, and fire. I'm just going to focus on move and fire for now. So what we can do is make a private input action called move and a private input action called fire. And to enable, what we can say is instead of player controls.enable, we could say move is equal to our player controls dot player. Conversely, you could also do UI, as those are the two action maps in our player input actions, but we want the player. And we could say move, then we can say move.enable. In our onDisable, we can simply just say move.disable. Instead of setting the move direction to the player controls, we can set this to move. And once again, our game is back to working. I can make a private method here, private void fire. And in here, what we want to say is input action.callbackContext. And you can call it whatever you want, but context seems to be conventional. And just to test this, right now all I'm going to do is debug.log we fired. But this could be like your shooting logic or maybe your interact logic to pick something up. This is where it would go. Back in onEnable, what we could say is fire is equal to player controls dot player dot fire. Well, you can initialize this by enabling it. And now we want to register that fire method to the event. And to do that is very simple. We can simply say fire.performed plus equals fire. And then onDisable, we simply want to say fire.disable as well. And within this fire action, we see that the left mouse button should trigger it. So if I play the game and I click, we notice in the console it says we fired. So at this point it is registering every single time we click the left mouse button. And this would be true if you hit space or any individual button as well, as long as you had it configured in this input map. But that's not all. If you keep clicking the left mouse button over and over, and you actually just go to my YouTube channel and click on the subscribe button, well then you subscribe to me. Do it right now.